Beltane and Mayday. What's the difference? Hello, my friends. Welcome back. So it is the last day of April today. The 1st of May is tomorrow. Mayday! 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 Or Beltane. So in this video, I'd like to talk about Beltane and also Mayday and some of the sort of historic origins and sort of later customs as well. Some of the symbolism and meaning to our ancestors and modern peoples as well. And then I'd like to talk about some of the differences, if any, between these 2 days, and maybe some things you might like to do towards the end of the video if you want to sort of connect with this ancient day. And finally, at the very end, I'll give you a link to a story. Okay, here goes. So, Beltane, in a nutshell, is an ancient Celtic or Gaelic fire festival at about this time of year, the very end of April, heading into the 1st of May. And this is one of the 4 great fire festivals in the sort of, Celtic calendar. One of the 2 great ones, you might say, the other one being Samhain, or Halloween, as we now normally call it, which marks the beginning of winter. But Beltane marks the beginning of summer. Good times are on the way. So there's also some sort of similarities between these 2 days as well. They're both, practically speaking, to do with things you might do with animals in a kind of pastoral culture, an animal herding culture back in the day. They also both involve fires, very, very large fires, normally outdoors, and some ritual activities to do with those. And they're also usually considered to be sort of thin times. It's a gateway time, it's a door time where spirits of the other side may permeate our reality, traditionally speaking. We normally think of that at Halloween. We don't think of it so much this time of year, but it's certainly associated with she, with fairies, with woodland spirits that may do mischief, that kind of thing. So there is something called the Wheel of the Year in contemporary pagan thought, but it's a very, very old idea where the year is divided according to what the sun is doing and what our agricultural and farming ancestors were doing based on that solar cycle. So it's divided like this. There's a summer solstice and the winter solstice. They're the main ones. Then there's the spring and autumn equinox between those. And then between those, there's something called the cross-quarter days. So these are the 4 main Celtic fire festivals. There's Imbolc, there's Beltane, there's Lunasa, and there's Samhain. So Samhain and Beltane are kind of opposite each other on that Wheel of the Year. Sometimes these are said to be Celtic days, but actually these days have been honoured in pre-Celtic times as well. Just last year, I was at a stone circle in Ireland with my partner Tamsin and our dog, and we just stumbled across a stone circle called Beltane Stone Circle. I will show you it now. A Bronze Age stone circle, so quite actually new for a stone circle, but on an earlier Neolithic site. And the current theory is it's orientated or was to do with celebrations at Beltane, which is unusual because most monuments like that are orientated on either the winter or the summer solstice, or both. So to have a Beltane orientated one is unusual, but there it is in history there in Ireland. Closer to home for me anyway, in southern England, there are many causewayed enclosures, hill forts, these are sometimes called, but they're not all defensive. And many of these we see evidence in, not of habitation, but of animal husbandry, of people keeping animals there during the winter months and then releasing them in the summer, at the beginning of the summer months. And we have evidence in the ground of vast slaughter and feasting of animals and huge fires being made where huge amounts of these animals were killed and eaten, and it was probably also a ritual site. So these sort of Neolithic and Bronze Age and Iron Age enclosures are having multiple functions: ceremonial, defensive, and also practical. So I've already hinted what Beltane is kind of all about in one way. It's sort of the time when our ancestors, our herding ancestors, would have been driving cattle or whatever herds to their summer pastures from the winter ones. And in many cases, in the winter pastures, they would have been in these causewayed enclosures. So then they're just driven out onto the rolling green hills for the summer months. Obviously, this is a tricksy time of year, and you need to do various ritual things to purify and protect those cattle. So that might be something like driving the cattle between two fires, or forcing them to jump over fires, or purifying them in the smoke between various ritual fires, and doing various ritual spells and incantations over these cattle to protect them from diseases, or to maybe appease various discarnate entities, various demons or spirits that might infect that very valuable livestock, that commodity, your livelihood, with diseases. So you've got to appease those spirits. So that's sort of what this day is all about, or was all about at one point, the sort of moving the livestock from one pasture to another. But in the ancient world, of course, ritual and practical things are just completely meshed together. So, ceremony and practical things are just enmeshed. So that was sort of what it was about: a fire festival, a purification time, but also just a welcoming in the summer months, ritually speaking. So that sort of is Beltane, and that's sort of something that's carried on through this sort of celebration of summer. And there would have been a lot of storytelling. There would have been maybe marriage vows made. This probably would have been a time of great fertility because the land is waking up. There probably would have been offerings to land spirits, that kind of thing. Mayday is maybe more of a general term for the Europe-wide phenomena of these kind of events. So Beltane is obviously a Gaelic word meaning bright fire or lucky fire. That's probably the most likely thing. It's fire-related, fire festival, but some suggest it might have something to do with death as well, which is interesting, kind of makes sense because this is a sort of transitional time. But to call this day kind of Celtic, maybe, I mean, Beltane as we have it now is sort of, we associate it with Scotland and Ireland and the Isle of Man, Celtic speaking areas, or where Celtic languages are still spoken today. But originally, this would have been a Europe-wide phenomenon, and as I've already insinuated in some of these Neolithic enclosures in Britain, this is before Celtic people even came to these islands. So it's not just a Celtic thing. So maybe the term Mayday is more a general term for these practices that we can see have happened across Europe at this time of year, not just in Britain and Ireland. But normally when I think of Mayday, I think of maybe a slightly more recent English phenomenon. I think of May Queens, I think of green men, I think of Morris dancers, I think of maypoles, I think of dancing around the maypoles and all these wonderful things. I think of the Fairy Queen, I think of Shakespeare, it feels like quite an English custom. And in a way it is. A lot of this stuff, this May Queens and maypoles, it might only date back as far as the sort of medieval period. We don't know, but it may well have its roots in pre-Christian time. But the sort of the paper trail is gone. But certainly the imagery resonates with sort of pre-Christian thought. So some interesting things here. The maypoles really interest me. Some people suggest, many conservative historians might suggest, that the maypole is simply a celebration that the warmer times have returned. Yes, I think that's true, but I find it a bit simplistic. I find it a bit reductive. The word simply is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Clearly, there's this fertility symbolism there. There's this resonance with an earlier thing. But this is the point here. A lot of these post-Christian secular folk customs, they may not be a direct survival of pagan times, but they have fuck all to do with Christianity, obviously. I think this is a fulfilling a subconscious need here that was screaming to be fulfilled in the pagan times, and also in the Renaissance, when there was a sort of flourishing. The pagan dream of the Renaissance flourished. There was a sort of great big pagan hallucination that lasted from all the way through the Renaissance and flourished again in the Enlightenment, and is kind of coming back now. So obviously, some unconscious need needing to be sort of spoken. But some interesting symbology here. The maypole, some people suggest this is sort of phallic symbolism, which does make sense. Others throw shade on that and say, well, they're not actually carved like penises. No, phallic symbolism often isn't, but it's kind of there with the fertility of the land and the shape of the things. More attractive to me is the idea of the axis mundi, which may have been taken from earlier Germanic paganism, the medieval and the early medieval, not too far apart. This makes a lot of sense because it has echoes in a lot of other cultures where we have a kind of pole or tree representing a world axis, such as the Norse Yggdrasil, the world tree on which all the sort of worldly realms are hung. So that's a definite idea that we've got no idea. There's no sort of direct. No one's ever said that in history, but the symbolism is there. Another interesting idea is this maypole might be a remembrance of tree worship in Germanic paganism. There's a good reasons to think this because we have a lot of evidence of tree worship in Germanic areas. That's the idea put forward by James Fraser in The Golden Bough. Quite a dated work, this, as some say, but it still has a lot of good ideas in it, as long as you sort of take it with a pinch of salt. That a lot of these Mayday customs, even if they were arguably later developments, were certainly thought of as pagan by the Puritans, writing in the late medieval period. I don't know, one such Puritan whose name eludes me was kind of talking with horror about all the young people and the maidens that would go off into the woods collecting flowers and branches of trees and bringing them back and decorating their assemblies with them. And, he says, scarcely 1/3 of them would return undefiled. Very puritanical language. So it all sounds very Wicker Man, doesn't it? Young folk going out into the woods, shagging, collecting flowers, and bringing them back. That does have echoes with earlier pagan practices. For example, the Roman festival of Floralia. That might be the blueprint of some of these things. Again, we've got no direct linking evidence for that, but just the practices and imagery does resonate very strongly. So in Floralia, it was celebrated in name of the Roman goddess Flora, sort of goddess of flowers and vegetation and sexuality and fertility. And there would be a lot of misrule during this time, and drunkenness and fornication and gathering of flowers, and people would be pelted by legumes and things like that, so we see a lot of resonances with that in later Mayday custom as well. You could also argue that the May Queen is. Fraser argued that was a sort of remembrance of a tree goddess, a dryad. Again, we don't really have any direct evidence for that, but I just really love the idea. But certainly, I would say this seems to be a human incarnation of the goddess, doesn't it? We see that reflected in a lot of cultures across the world, in a lot of Hindu practice as well, sort of avatara. So that's a definite possibility, even if we can't properly date the May Queen. That that imagery is going on there. The goddess moving through us in a procession through a village, people throwing flowers, that kind of thing. So the fact that a lot of these practices were banned by Puritans that were really trying to put the dampener on these, as they saw them, pagan practices, show is really interesting. It is really interesting. Certainly, these practices were very subversive. Amazing that Morris dancing used to be a highly subversive act. You're giving two fingers up to the Puritans. So some differences then between Beltane and Mayday. I've kind of already hinted at some of these. You could say Beltane is more of a Celtic thing, and Mayday is sort of more associated with Germanic areas. That is true to a degree, but as I've already said, that's less the case now, where kind of in modern syncretic traditions, these two, everything's kind of merged together. But also, the further we go back in time, Celtic and Germanic just kind of melds into one people anyway. So I'm not sure about that distinction. Another good distinction is Beltane, as I said at the beginning, is about animal herding. This is pastoral economy, whereas the Mayday traditions with hanging things on the maypole, that is more to do with agrarian economy. So there's sort of a difference there historically. One's to do with crops and one's to do with cows. You could also say that Beltane, I don't know whether Mayday has any of the ideas of, actually, no, they both do. Both have associations with the other world. Fairy queens and fairies abound at Mayday. Yeah, this might be a later medieval association. But the Sidhe are walking abroad at Beltane as well, spirits of the dead. So a bit of a crossover there. Beltane, I suppose, realistically speaking, is the night before the 1st of May, whereas Mayday is on the 1st of May. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there's more similarity between these two traditions. I guess Beltane is an example of a wider Mayday tradition. That's the distinction, I suppose. So if you want to lean into this day, into this festival idea, into the old ways a little bit, maybe you're a contemporary pagan, or maybe you just want to kind of raise a hand to the old ones a little bit and just step back into the ancestors' shoes a little bit. Well, I think probably the main thing is light a fire, ideally outside if you can. In fact, I would say maybe go and take a leaf out of those young men and women that the Puritans were hating on in the late medieval period, and go frolicking in the woods and collect flowers. Traditionally, these are yellow flowers to reflect fire. Maybe decorate your home with flowers, yellow or red flowers if you can find them. Light a fire outside, light a fire inside, walk between them, jump over the fire, pour some whiskey or some beer into the fire, light a candle for some lost ones, place an offering of some mead or some flour or some flowers on the ground outside for the others so they don't come and devour your life. These are all some things you can do. Something else you can do is drink and make merry and tell each other stories. So this is a traditional Beltane thing. There are many, many stories from Irish mythology that are set on Beltane. Just like this one, I would like to tell you now, called The Voyage of Bran, which begins at Beltane. So I'll put a link to that video here. Also, if you want to go out collecting some flowers and you live in Britain and Ireland, just keep an eye out for the bluebell, but maybe don't pick them because, well, if you want to know why, I've made a video on bluebells here, the Mayday flower. See you later.